Andrew Harrison. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Cincinnati, and I will be discussing the paper that we submitted to the Midwest Association for Information Systems Conference called the Reactions to Online Criticism, Retaliatory Behaviors in Peer-to-Peer Networks. This is a paper that I wrote together with two of my colleagues here at the University of Cincinnati, Craig Froehle and Dave Rapien. And today what we're going to be discussing is first we'll start going through what motivated the paper, how we came up with this idea in the first place, some of the theoretical background that we used to inform us, and then how we designed an experiment to test what we were interested in, and as part of that process, how we had to design a peer-to-peer grading system that we named MyEduForum. And finally, we'll discuss some of the results that we had and the implications that we have both in terms of theory and practice. The paper was largely motivated by a conversation that we had at a holiday party a few years ago. We'd noticed at the time that there was an increasing trend, particularly at our university, moving towards larger online courses. And obviously, since the COVID crisis has struck, this has become increasingly relevant as well. So although this trend had existed before, I think the COVID crisis has sort of sped this up and it's become more center stage. And that's that more and more programs, universities across the country, are moving towards more online classes. And they tend to be larger because they are more scalable than face-to-face classes because you lack the face-to-face infrastructure that's necessary for a face-to-face course. And so these large classes can have thousands of participants at times. And so because of that, assessment becomes a little bit more difficult. And traditional forms of assessment where, say, one professor would grade a number of papers by the students or projects by the students, it's not really feasible. And so to use a more feasible approach, a lot of these larger online courses start to use peer-to-peer assessment as an alternative. And peer-to-peer assessment has worked really well in some capacities. For example, we use peer-reviewed papers for our research. And another example would be the tenure process is largely the result of peer-to-peer assessment in academia. And so peer-to-peer assessment isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it can work really well. But in these large online environments, it's relatively untested. And so we started to look at some of the factors that affect online environments. One of the major concerns is de-individuation. That's when people basically don't see other people as individuals, and they start to see people as more of a social group or a lump of people. In those cases, when you have de-individuated environments, a lot of negative or antisocial behaviors can occur. One of the ones that we were most concerned about is retaliation or retaliatory behaviors. Mainly, if somebody is given a bad grade in one of these peer-to-peer assessment contexts, are they going to pass along the bad grade that they got to the people that they assess, or will they assess those people's work on merit? Because obviously it won't work in a large peer-to-peer grading context if people are being graded mainly by feelings of vindictiveness or rather than being judged by the merit of their work. So that's really what we had been concerned about and what we wanted to investigate. And as a result, the two research questions that sort of spiraled out of our conversations were we wanted to know how people would react to feedback in these large online courses, and what conditions, both environmental and personal, could bring about these retaliatory tendencies, and understand how people responded during negative events in online environments. We really wanted to figure out if there was some type of theoretical approach that we could base our research on to provide us some understanding. And the theoretical basis that we used was cognitive appraisal theory. The idea is that basically people are going to respond to negative events with some type of appraisal reaction. They're going to consider what happened in the event and what their possible outcomes are that are associated with the event. And in that way, they can develop their own plans for how they're going to respond to different types of things. So the main theory that we were using is one developed by Schur, the model, and in it, people go through basically 4 appraisal responses when they encounter some type of negative event. And these basically are designed to determine how a person perceives that event is going to affect them and what are the possible ramifications or outcomes that will result from it. And so first they consider whether the event's relevant or not. Then they consider what types of consequences or magnitude of consequences that are associated with the event, what type of actions they can take of their own volition to cope with the event, and then finally what it's going to do to their personal sense of self or how they identify themselves. And that their responses to these types of negative events tend to be driven largely by their sense of self, how they feel, or their sense of justice. And a few recurring themes started to come up when we were looking at the research in cognitive appraisal theory's approach towards how people deal with bad news. And a few of them are, one is it differs depending on people's personality. Some people tend to respond to bad news by doubling down and working harder. Other people respond to bad news by saying that it's out of their volition and they can't deal with it. So it tends to be personality driven at times, and it's a very emotional process, and it involves feelings of fairness. And then finally, people don't like when bad news is unexpected or when it seems like they don't understand the reasoning behind it. And again, this is because it tends to be an emotional process and they're trying to figure out how they can correct that. And if they don't necessarily understand how they can connect the dots between what they've done and the ramifications of the event, so if there's some type of disconnect in this appraisal response process, that it can make people really upset. And that's when they start to lash out and start to engage in retaliatory or other antisocial behaviors. Since our concerns were primarily related to how people responded to unexpected news and how their personalities would affect their responses, we tried to collect data to test our theories in an experimental setting. So what we did was we had one of the professors at our university who taught a really large course. So it was 450 students roughly. And we developed a peer-to-peer grading system that we actually had them use during the course of the semester. And they would create blog posts, basically, and they would be grading each other's blog posts. And you can see one of the notes from the course handout that we included here on the right-hand side of the screen, that the idea was we wanted to make it significant enough that it would affect them and that they would care about what they were posting. But at the same time, we had to work really closely with the IRB here to ensure that the students wouldn't feel like something was being done to them or that it would affect their academic ability as well. So we wanted to be really careful about that. So after working with the IRB, we came up with a way that students could do effectively an optional assignment each week, and they would post on a subject that was related to the course, and then they would grade posts from other people, presumably other students. So to do that, though, we had to create the actual peer-to-peer grading site. So we coded it, created the website that worked for it. And then after we were done coding it and gathering all the seed data that we needed for it, then we started to survey the students during the first week of the 15-week course. So they filled out a battery of survey information, mostly about how they prefer to learn, what they like in an instructor, but also some of the batteries of tests were related to their personal preferences and psychological factors. And those would include things like the dark triad and the big five. So we were trying to see or get some personality data that we could include in the analyses as well. And so then after we'd done that, a few weeks later, faculty members went in and introduced the actual peer-to-peer grading site. And explained what it was going to be used for and demoed it for the students to show them how they'd be using it. And then during the course of the remainder of the class, which was about 11 weeks, we collected data from the students' postings each week, and we used that to analyze how they would respond to the peer-to-peer grading. Sure, the students would actually use the peer-to-peer grading site. We made it as professional as possible. So the site was actually registered, and the students, it had a professional look and functionality to it. The students were told that they would be posting and rating other people's posts so that we could use those as a way to assess an automated grading algorithm that we were developing. So this is what the homepage to the website looked like. And then in addition to the homepage of the website, once the students logged on each week, they would be prompted to create a post. So in this example that you're seeing right now, the topic for their post would be, what does it mean to say we're in a post-PC world? And this topic was related to the coursework that they'd been learning during that week. So they were prompted to create a blog post. They created the blog post. On average, they were about 150 words. And then when they logged in towards the bottom, they would see any posts they'd previously made along with ratings of those posts. So a few days after they would create a post, the rating, which was given as either a thumb up or a thumbs down, would show up for their respective posts, so they could see the quality of the work that they'd done before. So we chose to use a thumbs up, thumbs down design rather than some type of numerical rating, like rating 1 through 10 or 1 through 100, because we were trying to make this system seem easier to use and as close to something like Twitter or Reddit as possible, because those represented popular platforms that the students were using to rate work online. Students created their own posts with their own self-generated content. We actually asked them to rate other posts from other students as well. And so the idea was that they would present some of their own work, and in return, they would also grade some work of other students. So you can see here, they would rate, in the first example, they were rating a topic. You see the business value of information systems is derived from infrastructural, operational, strategic use. So this is really similar to the why does IT matter posts in the early 2000s. And they would read through the response to that post and then choose whether they liked that post or disliked the post. And the idea here really was that we wanted to see whether their choice, whether they liked or disliked posts, was mainly based on the content quality of the post itself, or whether it was being driven by their personality or the feedback that they'd received in the previous week as well. So for those of you that have read the paper, you probably already know this, but the twist to it was that the feedback that they received, the likes or dislikes on their own post, were actually not created by other students. The students were under the impression that they were being graded by students at other similar universities or similar sized state universities, but instead the posts were actually generated by some type of function or algorithm that we created. And so we divided the students up, so there were about 450 of them, so roughly 90 in a group, and we split them up into 5 different groups. And the idea was that each group would have a different algorithm that represented the number of likes or dislikes that they received. And so you can see that the two were inversely related from this. So some groups, so for instance, group number 1, received basically even number of likes and dislikes the entire time. So they received roughly 350 likes and 350 dislikes on every post throughout the entire 11 weeks. Other groups, group 2, for example, received a lot of likes. Generally, they received somewhere around 650 likes and only about 50 dislikes on all of their posts. Whereas other groups either gradually saw the number of likes increase or decrease. And the group that we were the most interested in, that was really our way to test that that feature that we were looking at for unexpected bad news, or when you get unpredictable feedback, was group number 5. And you can see that it has a stair-step pattern. So basically, they were given unequivocally good responses to their posts for the first half of the experiment. And then in the second half, they were given really bad feedback. So they started by getting a really high ratio of likes to dislikes. And then halfway through, it abruptly changed, and they started getting a high number of dislikes and a very low number of likes on their posts. It turns out when we got to the analysis that that group in particular, the one that had the stair-step pattern, group number 5, ended up being quite a bit different than the rest of the groups. Most of the groups behaved in ways that we thought would generally happen, although there were a few surprises. But it turns out that getting abrupt bad news or unexpected bad news can actually make people turn fairly negative in comparison to other people. So some of the groups where they had, say, steady negative feedback, so the total number of likes and dislikes would have actually been almost the exact same, but the feedback would have been consistent the whole time, didn't have the same type of decrease to the way that they rated other people that this group that had the stair-step had. So this group 5 actually showed that when someone receives generally good feedback initially, and then their feedback turns negative, that they tend to be much more at risk for lashing out and having retaliatory behaviors than other people would. And you can see that there was a huge difference for them, or at least a statistically significant difference for them after the feedback started turning negative. So in weeks 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, when there started to be change, that's when you started to see the feedback for them started to change as well. And they turned much more negative in the way that they assessed other people's work. And unfortunately, that seems to point out that there are some retaliatory effects at play here. And they weren't necessarily judging solely based on merit, but were rather taking out some of the negative feelings and emotions that they received from getting poor grades or poor feedback on their own posts that they'd made in the previous week, and they were forwarding those on to other people. And one of the other interesting things that you'd note in this is in week 8, you'll see that all of the ratings had dipped. That week 8 in general had a lot more negative feedback than any other week. And interestingly enough, that was also the week of the midterms for our students. And so it appears that there are some external factors that can influence the mood of feedback as well. And so it appears that these types of emotion-driven responses really do turn up in peer-to-peer grading. And then to extend what we'd learned now about how unexpected negative news occurs in these online peer-to-peer grading settings, we also wanted to look at personality. And the important finding that we found for personality is that certain people, specifically those that are high in the dark triad being psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism, and those would have been measured with the Levine's LSRP, the Mach-4, and the NP-I-16, which are fairly common measures of the dark triad, indicate that these people tend to be very mercurial. So when they tend to have their feedback even more strongly driven by the responses that they've received on their own work, rather than by the quality of the work that they were grading. So when they received a lot of likes, people high in the dark triad tended to respond in kind by providing more likes to other people's posts. But similarly, when someone disagreed with their ideas or when they perceived them as worse, so when they got more dislikes, they also responded in kind, and they tended to be more extreme in both conditions than people that are low in the dark triad. So there are these mercurial effects of personality that actually exacerbate the retaliatory behaviors that are occurring in these peer-to-peer grading contexts. So that brings us to what we can actually conclude from this and how it's going to influence the future research that we do and that's related to this project. So one of our core findings was that consistency is critical in these peer-to-peer grading contexts. So if we're moving towards more and more large online classes and we're scaling them up and we need to rely on more peer-to-peer assessment, we're going to need to find ways that we can ensure that that assessment is consistent for students. We want to ensure that they see a validity in it and they feel like there's that it's justice or merit driven. And to do that, we need to make sure that type of feedback that they get is consistent when it's coming from their peers. So things like grading rubrics would be a very strong potential benefit. And making sure the rotation in the students tends to be random, right? So that some students aren't grading the same students' work over and over and over. So there's ways that we could probably increase consistency in terms of the students' feedback, and that in turn should create this spiral of effects where they in turn will be more merit-based and less emotion-driven when grading other people's work. And then the next part was that personality really does matter, and that certain people are going to be more mercurial in peer-to-peer grading environments, which is a reason why we need to be careful in terms of this way that we distribute the work that's being graded amongst a population. That some people are going to be more driven by the feedback they receive than other people are going to be less driven by it, and we'll try to use a more merit-based approach. And finally, this leads us to where we're moving in the future research directions. There's a lot of personality characteristics that we really would like to investigate. The dark triad is really sort of the tip of the iceberg, it's a very obvious thing in terms of it tends to affect a lot of retaliatory behaviors, but there's also a lot of other personality characteristics as far as the way the big five are concerned. And now some of the things that we're seeing in terms of online research that indicate way groups develop norms, that certain people might feel ostracized or marginalized within the group as well. And those are all really important things to investigate. So that's one of the areas that we wanted to look at. But in addition to that, we still have quite a bit of data that we need to sort through in terms of outcomes as well. So so far, this whole research design has basically looked at how peer-to-peer grading or peer-to-peer grades received would affect grades given. And that primarily was the focus of this particular research paper. But there's other things that we're really interested in and those would include, will people continue to use these systems? Will they propagate and assimilate into the businesses and universities? And that's a really important question to answer. And so we did collect a bunch of information about whether people enjoyed using the peer-to-peer website that we created and whether they'd continue to use it as well. And the ratings, although not exactly mirrored, they tended to follow fairly closely the likes and dislikes as well. There tended to be general patterns that you could infer from them. So we want to do a little bit more research into how negative or positive feedback affects people's continued willingness to use a platform as well. And then one of the more interesting things that we noted was that the group that received negative feedback in that stair-step pattern, so the group 5 that received the unexpected, abrupt negative feedback, actually started to, as their feedback got more and more negative, the posts that they created tended to get actually more and more intricate. And so the number of words they had, as well as the length of the words and the complexity of the linguistics that they used, actually increased over time. And so at the same time, they were getting angrier and grading other people's work more harshly. They were also putting more effort into making their own work better, which was a really interesting feature, because the opposite was true of some of the other groups. So some of the groups that received consistently great feedback on their posts basically stopped working as hard, and their posts got shorter and less detailed. Whereas the group that received this negative feedback and got angrier actually put more effort into their work. So there are some pretty interesting paradoxes that are happening in terms of the way people react with their own self-effort, but also with the way that they impose their reactions upon others. So hopefully we have a lot of really interesting things that we can follow up on and look at for future research. So unfortunately, this kind of concludes where we were going with the research agenda for today. But if you have any questions or comments, either on the current research project that we've done or some of the things that we can look at to extend this in the future, I'd really love to hear from you. The best way to reach me would be by email at andrew.harrison@uc.edu. And again, my name is Andrew Harrison, and I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Cincinnati. And thank you.